The daguerreotype plate caught the afternoon light streaming through the parlor windows of the Whitmore boarding house, its silvered surface gleaming like polished metal. Edmund Ashworth adjusted his position in the burgundy velvet chair, feeling the stiff horsehair stuffing beneath the worn fabric. The October chill of 1883 had settled into the bones of the old Connecticut building, and he pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders. Beside him, his younger brother Frederick sat with identical posture, hands folded across his lap in the precise manner their mother had drilled into them since childhood. "Hold perfectly still, gentlemen," called the photographer from behind his large camera apparatus, his voice muffled by the black cloth draped over his head. "Any movement will blur the image, and we cannot afford to waste another plate." Edmund's jaw tightened at the reminder of their dwindling funds. The brothers had traveled from Boston specifically for this portrait, commissioned by their late uncle's estate as part of the inheritance proceedings. The legal documents required photographic proof of their identities, and the Whitmore boarding house parlor, with its ornate furnishings and respectable atmosphere, provided the perfect backdrop for such formal documentation. Behind them, the magnificent mirror dominated the far wall. Its gilded frame bore intricate carvings of cherubs and flowering vines, crafted by some long-dead artisan whose skill had survived decades of New England winters. The mirror's surface reflected the room with startling clarity, the gaslight fixtures with their cut-glass shades, the floral wallpaper with its pattern of roses and thorns, even the photographer's equipment positioned near the window. Frederick shifted slightly, and Edmund caught the movement from the corner of his eye. His younger brother had always been restless, unable to sit still for extended periods even as a child. During their Sunday church services, Frederick would fidget and squirm until their father's stern glance forced him into temporary compliance. Now, at 26 years old, he still carried that same nervous energy, though he had learned to channel it into his work as a clockmaker, where precision and patience were essential. "Almost finished," the photographer announced, his hand hovering over the camera's brass fittings. "Just a few more seconds, and we shall have captured you both for posterity." Edmund allowed himself a small smile at the thought. Posterity seemed like such a grand concept for two middle-class brothers from Massachusetts, yet here they were, having their likenesses preserved for future generations. Perhaps, someday, their own descendants would examine this very photograph, wondering about the lives and dreams of the two young men seated in matching chairs. The chemical smell from the photographer's plates filled the air, sharp and metallic. Edmund had witnessed the daguerreotype process before, marveling at how light itself could be trapped and fixed onto a silver-coated copper sheet. The science behind it remained largely mysterious to him, but the results were undeniably remarkable, images of such clarity and detail that they surpassed even the finest painted portraits. "There," the photographer said, emerging from beneath his cloth with obvious satisfaction. "The exposure is complete. You may relax your positions while I prepare the plate for development." Edmund stretched his shoulders, feeling the tension release from muscles held rigid for nearly 3 minutes. Frederick immediately stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the elm trees that lined Millfield's main street. Their yellow leaves caught the October sunlight, creating a golden canopy that seemed to glow with inner fire. "Do you think Uncle Harrison would approve of this formal arrangement?" Frederick asked, his reflection appearing in the window glass as he spoke. He always preferred more casual gatherings, less ceremony and pretense. "The lawyers require proper documentation," Edmund replied, joining his brother at the window. Uncle Harrison understood the importance of legal procedures. He would not have wanted his estate disputed due to insufficient evidence of our identities. The photographer worked at a small table in the corner, his movements precise and practiced as he handled the delicate plate. The chemical baths released vapors that made Edmund's eyes water slightly, but he found himself fascinated by the transformation taking place. Somewhere in those solutions their images were emerging from nothing, as if summoned from the ether itself. 41 years later, in the autumn of 1924, Dr. Harold Brennan would hold this same daguerreotype under a magnifying glass in his Boston laboratory, his weathered hands trembling with excitement and disbelief. The optical specialist had examined thousands of photographic images throughout his career, analyzing everything from portrait inconsistencies to evidence of supernatural phenomena. He had developed a reputation for debunking fraudulent spirit photographs and exposing the tricks used by unscrupulous mediums to deceive grieving families. But this image defied every principle of optical science he had ever learned. Two brothers sat clearly visible in their velvet chairs, their poses identical, their clothing and expressions captured in perfect detail. Yet in the ornate mirror behind them, only one reflection appeared. Edmund's image stared back from the silvered glass, his hands folded, his expression serious and dignified. Where Frederick's reflection should have been, only empty space remained. Not darkness, not shadow, but simply nothing at all. Dr. Brennan called in two colleagues, both respected experts in photographic analysis. Together, they subjected the daguerreotype to every test available to their profession. They examined the silver coating under powerful microscopes, searching for signs of manipulation or chemical interference. They studied the angle of the mirror, calculating the precise positioning required for the reflections. They even recreated the scene in Brennan's laboratory using period-appropriate equipment and techniques. Every test confirmed their initial findings. The daguerreotype was authentic, created using standard 1883 processes with no evidence of tampering or double exposure. The chemical composition of the plate matched other verified examples from the same era. The photographer's signature and date markings showed no signs of alteration or forgery. Yet somehow, impossibly, the mirror had refused to acknowledge Frederick Ashworth's presence entirely. The younger brother existed in the physical world, clearly visible to the camera's lens, but the laws of reflection seemed not to apply to him. Light struck his form and scattered in all directions except toward the mirror's surface, as if he existed in some parallel dimension that intersected with reality at every point except that crucial moment of reflection. What you're about to hear challenges everything we understand about light, reflection, and the nature of existence itself. The screaming began at precisely 9:30 in the morning, cutting through the peaceful stillness of Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore's boarding house like a blade through silk. Thomas Ashworth dropped his morning coffee cup, the fine china shattering against the polished wooden floor of the dining room as the sound pierced the air from somewhere above. The elderly woman who had been serving him breakfast stood frozen, her weathered hands trembling as she clutched the silver serving tray against her chest. "Dear God in heaven," she whispered, her face draining of all color. That came from the mirror room. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he pushed back from the mahogany dining table, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor with an unpleasant screech. The screaming continued, raw and desperate, echoing through the corridors of the three-story Victorian house. It was a sound he had never heard before, not quite human, yet unmistakably filled with terror and anguish. He took the stairs two at a time, his leather boots pounding against the carpeted steps as he raced toward the source of the commotion. The second-floor hallway stretched before him, lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow his movement. Gas lamps flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows that made the corridor feel alive with unseen movement. The screaming had stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that felt far more unsettling than the noise had been. Thomas approached the door to his brother's room with growing dread, his hand hesitating over the brass doorknob. The silence pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock at the end of the hallway. "Edward?" he called softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Edward, are you all right?" There was no response. Thomas turned the handle slowly, the mechanism clicking with mechanical precision as the door swung open on well-oiled hinges. The room beyond was bathed in the pale morning light that filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across the Persian rug that covered the hardwood floor. His brother stood in the center of the room, perfectly still, facing the enormous mirror that dominated the far wall. The glass was a masterpiece of Venetian craftsmanship, nearly 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide, framed in ornate silver that had been polished to a brilliant shine. Mrs. Whitmore had purchased it at considerable expense, claiming it was the finest mirror north of New York City. "Edward," Thomas said again, stepping into the room. His brother remained motionless, his shoulders rigid beneath his pressed white shirt. "I heard screaming. Was that you?" Edward's reflection stared back from the mirror's surface, but something about it seemed wrong. Thomas moved closer, studying his brother's face in the glass. Edward's expression was blank, his eyes wide and unblinking, as if he were seeing something that existed beyond the physical world. His mouth hung slightly open, and Thomas could see that his hands were trembling despite his otherwise statue-like stillness. "What is it?" Thomas reached out to touch his brother's shoulder, but Edward jerked away as if burned. "Don't," Edward whispered, his voice hoarse and strained. "Don't touch me. And whatever you do, don't look directly into the mirror." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the October morning air. He positioned himself slightly behind his brother, trying to see what had caused such terror without looking directly into the glass surface. From his peripheral vision, he could make out their reflections. 2 men in their 30s, dressed in the dark suits that were appropriate for their business in Millfield. But there was something else in the reflection, something that shouldn't have been there. "Edward, what exactly are you seeing?" Thomas kept his voice calm and measured, though his pulse was racing. His brother had always been the steadier of the two, the one who approached problems with logic and careful analysis. To see him reduced to this state of barely controlled panic was deeply unsettling. "At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light," Edward said, his words coming in short, controlled bursts. "I was shaving, getting ready for our appointment with Father's attorney. I glanced up into the mirror, and I saw—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I saw someone else standing behind me." Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. The room was empty except for the 2 of them. He was certain of that. He had checked every corner, every shadow when he entered. Yet his brother's terror was genuine, and Edward was not a man given to flights of fancy or nervous delusions. "Describe what you're seeing," Thomas said, moving slightly to get a better angle without looking directly into the mirror's surface. "It's a man," Edward continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Middle-aged, wearing clothing from perhaps 20 or 30 years past. His face is—" Edward's voice caught in his throat. "His face is the most terrible thing I've ever seen, Thomas. It's filled with such rage, such hatred, and his eyes, they're fixed on me as if he knows me, as if he blames me for something." Thomas studied his brother's reflection more carefully, looking for any sign of the apparition Edward described. The mirror showed only the 2 of them, the room behind them, and the morning light streaming through the windows. Yet he could not shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with what he was seeing. The quality of the reflection seemed different somehow, the colors slightly muted, the shadows falling at angles that didn't quite match the actual room. And there was something about the way the light moved across the mirror's surface that suggested depth, as if the glass were not merely reflecting their world, but showing them another one entirely. "We need to leave this room," Thomas said, reaching for his brother's arm. "Whatever this is, we can deal with it from elsewhere." "I can't move," Edward replied, his voice tight with fear. "Every time I try to step away, he moves closer. And Thomas—" Edward's breathing became shallow and rapid. "I think he's trying to come through." As if summoned by his brother's words, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Thomas could see his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air, and frost began to form along the edges of the mirror's silver frame. The glass itself seemed to ripple slightly, as if it were made of water rather than solid matter. Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway behind them, her face pale and drawn. "Gentlemen, I heard the disturbance and I came to—" She stopped mid-sentence, staring at the mirror with the same expression of dawning horror that Thomas had seen on his brother's face. "You see it too," Edward said, never taking his eyes off the glass. "Tell me you see it too." The elderly woman nodded slowly, clutching the doorframe for support. "Lord preserve us," she whispered. "It's him. It's Jonathan Whitmore, my late husband's brother, but he's been dead these 15 years. Thomas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The rational part of his mind, the part that had been educated at Harvard and trained in the law, rejected what he was hearing. Yet the evidence was undeniable. 3 people were experiencing the same impossible phenomenon simultaneously. The mirror's surface began to undulate more violently, and Thomas could hear a sound like breaking glass, though the mirror itself remained intact. The temperature continued to drop, and ice crystals began forming on the inside of the windows. Whatever was happening was growing stronger, more insistent. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came not from the photograph, but from the mirror itself. The grandfather clock in Mrs. Whitmore's boarding house chimed 2:30 as photographer Josiah Crane adjusted his brass lens for the final time. Outside, a gentle autumn drizzle tapped against the parlor windows, casting shifting shadows across the ornate wallpaper. The air inside held the familiar scent of beeswax and old wood, mixed with the sharp chemical smell emanating from Crane's photographic equipment. "Gentlemen, please hold absolutely still," Crane instructed, his weathered hand steadying the heavy camera mounted on its wooden tripod. "This exposure will require 30 seconds of complete motionlessness." Edmund Ashworth sat rigidly in the velvet-upholstered chair, his jaw clenched with the effort of remaining statue still. Beside him, his younger brother Frederick appeared equally motionless, though something about his posture seemed almost unnaturally perfect, as if he had been carved from marble rather than flesh and blood. Their breathing was so shallow it was barely perceptible, creating an eerie stillness in the room. Mrs. Whitmore positioned herself in the doorway, her gray eyes watching the proceedings with keen interest. She had witnessed dozens of portrait sessions in her parlor over the years, but something about today felt different. The air seemed heavier somehow, charged with an inexplicable tension that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Crane counted silently, his pocket watch ticking away the seconds. 15 seconds passed. 20. 25. As the exposure neared completion, he noticed his tripod had shifted slightly, requiring a minor adjustment. Without breaking his concentration, he reached forward to steady the equipment. That was when he saw it. Behind the 2 brothers stood an enormous gilt-framed mirror, a family heirloom that had adorned the parlor wall for generations. In its silvered surface, Crane could see Edmund's reflection clearly. The serious set of his jaw, the careful positioning of his hands, even the way the afternoon light caught the fabric of his dark coat. But where Frederick's reflection should have been, there was only empty space. Crane blinked hard, certain that fatigue from a long day of work was playing tricks on his eyes. He had been up since dawn, preparing chemicals and loading plates, and the dim autumn light was hardly ideal for photography. Yet when he looked again, the impossible sight remained unchanged. Edmund's reflection stared back from the mirror with perfect clarity, while Frederick, solid and substantial in his chair, cast no reflection at all. The photographer's hands began to tremble slightly as he struggled to process what he was witnessing. In 30 years of professional photography, he had never encountered anything that defied the basic laws of nature so completely. Light behaved according to predictable principles. Mirrors reflected everything placed before them. These were fundamental truths of the physical world, as reliable as gravity or the rising of the sun. But the mirror seemed to have made its own decision about Frederick Ashworth. "Time," Crane announced, his voice slightly hoarse. The brothers relaxed their poses, Frederick stretching his neck with what appeared to be perfect normalcy. Yet Crane found himself staring at the mirror, watching as Edmund's reflection moved naturally while the space beside it remained stubbornly empty. Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. "How did it turn out, Mr. Crane?" "Will the portrait be satisfactory?" Crane's assistant, Martin Dewey, busied himself packing away the extra plates, seemingly oblivious to anything unusual. The young man had been facing away from the mirror during the exposure, focused entirely on organizing the equipment. Crane opened his mouth to mention what he had observed, then closed it again. How could he possibly explain what he had witnessed without sounding like a man losing his grip on reality? "I believe it will be quite unique," Crane managed, his eyes still fixed on the mirror. Frederick had risen from his chair and was examining some books on a nearby shelf, appearing perfectly solid and normal. Yet the mirror continued to ignore his presence entirely, reflecting only the room's furniture and Edmund's movements. Later that evening, after the brothers had departed and Mrs. Whitmore had retired to her quarters, Crane developed the photographic plate in his makeshift darkroom in the boarding house's cellar. His hands shook as he watched the image slowly emerge in the chemical bath. There was Edmund, captured with perfect clarity both in his chair and in the mirror's reflection behind him. The ornate frame of the mirror was clearly visible, along with the reflected furniture and wallpaper. But Frederick appeared only once, sitting in his chair with that same unnaturally perfect stillness. The mirror in the photograph showed only empty space where his reflection should have been, exactly as Crane had witnessed during the session. Martin Dewey, who had been assisting with the development process, stared at the photograph in stunned silence. "The younger brother seemed solid as stone," he later wrote in his private journal, "yet the looking-glass knew him not." Crane measured the parlor temperature that afternoon, a habit he had developed to ensure optimal conditions for his work. The thermometer read exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit, with no unusual atmospheric conditions that might explain such an extraordinary phenomenon. Everything about the session had been completely normal, except for this one impossible detail. That night, unable to sleep, Crane sat at his desk and opened his business ledger. In his careful handwriting, he recorded the day's events, though he knew no one would believe his account without seeing the photograph as evidence. The brass pen felt heavy in his trembling fingers as he wrote the words that would haunt him for years to come. The autumn rain continued to fall against his window as he completed his entry, the soft pattering providing an oddly peaceful soundtrack to his profound unease. He stared at the photograph one final time before filing it away, knowing that he had captured something that should not exist, evidence of a violation of natural law that challenged everything he understood about the world. "I have photographed hundreds of subjects, but never witnessed such a violation of natural law," Crane recorded in his business ledger. The mirror, it seemed, had already begun to forget Frederick Ashworth existed. The morning fog hung thick over Hartford as Professor Cornelius Blackwood adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and peered through the stereoscopic magnifying apparatus. November 3, 1883, had dawned cold and gray, matching the professor's increasingly troubled expression as he examined the photograph that had arrived from Millfield 3 days prior. The Hartford Institute of Optical Sciences had seen many peculiar cases, but nothing quite like this. Blackwood's weathered hands moved the photograph with surgical precision beneath the powerful lenses. At 62, he had spent the better part of 4 decades studying the properties of light, reflection, and optical phenomena. His reputation for meticulous analysis had made him the foremost authority on photographic anomalies in New England. Yet, as he studied the image before him, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the November air seeping through the laboratory windows. "Impossible," he muttered, his breath forming small clouds in the unheated room. The photograph showed 2 young men standing before an ornate mirror, but only one reflection stared back. Blackwood had initially suspected a double exposure or some photographer's trickery, but his measurements told a different story entirely. The professor's instruments revealed that the mirror's silvered backing showed no defects, scratches, or chemical degradation that could explain the missing reflection. Every inch of the reflective surface appeared perfect, unmarred by time or handling. The lighting conditions were optimal, the angle precise. By every scientific principle he understood, both figures should have appeared in the glass. Yet Frederick Ashworth, standing clearly visible on the left side of the frame, cast no reflection whatsoever. Blackwood removed his spectacles and rubbed his tired eyes. He had spent 3 sleepless nights poring over the photograph, consulting every textbook and journal in his extensive library. The laws of physics seemed to bend around this single image, defying explanation with a stubborn persistence that left him questioning his own sanity. A sharp knock on the laboratory door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, not looking up from his apparatus. Dr. Evangeline Porter stepped into the room, her medical bag clutched in one gloved hand and a leather satchel of chemical equipment in the other. Despite being one of only 3 women to graduate from the New Haven Medical College, Dr. Porter had earned grudging respect in the male-dominated field of photographic chemistry. Her analytical mind and steady hands had solved more than one puzzle that had stumped her male colleagues. "Professor Blackwood," she said, her voice crisp with professional authority. "I understand you have a photographic plate that requires spectroscopic analysis." Blackwood nodded grimly, gesturing toward the photograph. "Dr. Porter, I must warn you, what you're about to examine challenges everything we understand about the nature of reflection itself." Dr. Porter set down her equipment and approached the apparatus. As she peered through the lenses, her confident expression gradually shifted to one of bewilderment. She straightened, dark eyes wide with confusion. "This cannot be accurate," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The chemical composition of the plate appears entirely normal. There's no evidence of tampering or manipulation." "My thoughts exactly," Blackwood replied, "which is why I requested your expertise. If anyone can uncover the truth behind this anomaly, it's you." Dr. Porter spent the next 4 hours subjecting the photographic plate to every test in her considerable arsenal. Her laboratory notes, which would later be sealed in the Institute's vault until 1943, documented a discovery that would haunt both scientists for the remainder of their careers. The spectroscopic analysis revealed silver deposits consistent with a complete human figure. The chemical evidence showed that Frederick Ashworth's reflection should have been captured on the plate, yet only one reflection appeared in the developed image. "It's as if the light itself refuses to acknowledge his presence," Dr. Porter murmured, staring at her test results with growing unease. "The silver compounds react as though reflecting 2 figures, but the image shows only one. I've never encountered anything like this in 20 years of practice." Meanwhile, in the offices of the Connecticut State Police, Detective Inspector Reginald Morse spread 3 identical reports across his mahogany desk. Each document told the same impossible story: young men whose reflections had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and frightened witnesses. The reports had arrived from boarding houses along the railroad line, one from Bridgeport, another from New London, and a third from a small town called Millfield. Inspector Morse was a practical man who had built his career on facts and evidence. At 45, he had seen enough human nature to believe that most mysteries had logical explanations, usually involving greed, passion, or simple human error. But these reports suggested something far beyond his experience with conventional crime. The inspector's boots echoed through the narrow corridors of the train station as he made his way toward the platform. The journey to Millfield would take 3 hours, giving him time to review the case files and prepare his questions. He had telegraphed ahead, requesting interviews with both Frederick Ashworth and his brother Edmund, as well as Mrs. Whitmore, the boarding house proprietress. The train whistled mournfully as it pulled away from Hartford, carrying Inspector Morse toward a mystery that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the natural world. Through the window, the Connecticut countryside rolled past in shades of brown and gold, autumn's final flourish before winter's grip tightened on the land. At the Millfield boarding house, Frederick Ashworth sat in the parlor, his hands folded carefully in his lap as he waited for the police inspector's arrival. His brother Edmund paced nervously by the window, occasionally glancing at the mirrors that lined the room's walls, mirrors that now showed only Edmund's reflection, though both brothers stood clearly visible to anyone who looked directly at them. "Frederick," Edmund said, his voice tight with worry, "perhaps we should consider leaving. This investigation will only bring more attention, more questions we cannot answer." Frederick shook his head slowly. "Running would only make us appear guilty of something. Besides, Inspector Morse comes seeking truth, not condemnation. We have nothing to hide except this inexplicable condition that has befallen me." When Inspector Morse arrived that evening, he found Frederick articulate and responsive to all questions. The young man spoke clearly about his work at Ashworth and Company in Boston, his regular habits, and his growing distress over his peculiar affliction. A telegraph sent to Boston confirmed Frederick's employment, his regular attendance, and his unblemished reputation among colleagues and supervisors. The inspector also arranged for medical examinations, bringing in Dr. Harrison Wells from the local practice. Dr. Wells found Frederick's pulse, respiration, and reflexes entirely normal for a man of 26 years. His blood was red, his breath warm, his handshake firm. By every measure of human vitality, Frederick Ashworth was alive and healthy. Yet the mirrors told a different story. Inspector Morse watched in growing amazement as Frederick stood before surface after surface, casting no reflection whatsoever. The phenomenon had spread throughout the boarding house like some invisible contagion, claiming mirrors one by one in a pattern that defied explanation. Mrs. Whitmore led the inspector through the house, her voice trembling as she pointed out each affected mirror. "It started with the large looking glass in the front parlor," she explained, wringing her hands nervously. "Then the oval mirror in the dining room stopped showing his reflection. By the end of the week, even the small hand mirror in the guest room refused to acknowledge his presence." Inspector Morse made careful notes, documenting each mirror's size, placement, and the approximate date when Frederick's reflection had vanished from its surface. The pattern suggested some form of progression, moving from the largest mirrors to the smallest, as though whatever force was responsible grew stronger with each passing day. As October drew to a close, the impossible had become undeniable. Frederick Ashworth walked among them, spoke with them, shared meals and conversations, yet no mirror in Millfield would show his face. The local residents began crossing themselves when he passed, some whispering prayers, others averting their eyes entirely. Inspector Morse compiled his final report on the evening of October 20th, his pen scratching across the paper in the lamplight of his hotel room. The words felt surreal as he wrote them, yet he could not deny the evidence of his own eyes. Every investigation had led to the same conclusion. Every witness confirmed the same impossible truth. By October 20th, Frederick Ashworth had become invisible to every reflective surface in Millfield, though he remained perfectly visible to human eyes. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of mystery, the supernatural, and the fragile boundary between reality and illusion. Its purpose is to entertain, evoke curiosity, and inspire reflection on the unexplained phenomena that capture our imagination.